A 62-year-old woman stood in the middle of a cabin with no electricity, no running water, and no floor that could hold her weight without groaning. She held a rusted iron nail between her thumb and forefinger, square-headed, hand-forged, older than anyone alive, and she was laughing. The people in town already thought she'd lost her mind. A woman her age alone in a condemned structure on a mountain road that didn't appear on most maps. But what none of them knew, what even she didn't know yet, was that this nail and the hundreds like it buried in the bones of that rotting cabin would lead her to a discovery so valuable that the man who had thrown her away like yesterday's newspaper would drive 6 hours just to beg on her porch. 11 months. That's all it took for the joke to become an empire and the punchline to become the last laugh. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, stories about people who refused to stay down when the world pushed them to the floor, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. Marjorie Calloway Midge to the handful of people who still called her anything at all had been 62 years old for exactly 19 days when her husband of 40 years sat across from her at the kitchen table and rearranged the rest of her life in under 4 minutes. She remembered the time precisely because the coffee maker was still dripping. She'd set it for 6:45 the way she always did. And the last drops were falling into the pot when Douglas pulled out the chair across from hers, not beside her, across, and set his hands flat on the oak surface like a man about to close a deal. The kitchen smelled like hazelnut and toast. The radio on the counter was playing something soft, a song from a decade she couldn't quite place. Outside the window of their house in Meridian, just west of Boise, the April sky was doing what April skies in Idaho do, threatening rain without committing to it. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly as it had been for 14,600 mornings before this one, except that Douglas was wearing a suit she had never seen. Charcoal gray narrow lapels, the kind of cut that belonged on a man 20 years younger. And his jaw was set in that particular way, the way it locked when he'd already made a decision and was merely informing the world of it afterward. Midge poured coffee into his mug. The blue mug, the one with the chipped handle she kept meaning to replace. She set it in front of him. He didn't touch it. His voice came out flat, rehearsed the cadence of a man who had practiced in front of a mirror. I want a divorce. I've met someone. Her name is Brooke. I've already spoken to an attorney. The coffee maker clicked off. The song on the radio ended, and Midge stood there, holding her own mug, the white one, the one that said, "World's Best Grandma" in purple letters, a gift from Colleen's oldest, and she watched the steam rise and curl and disappear. And she thought with a strange, numb precision, the toast is going to burn. She reached over and pressed the lever on the toaster. The bread popped up perfectly golden. She set it on a plate. She buttered it. She did all of this while Douglas watched her with the expression of a man who had expected tears and received toast. His voice carried a flicker of irritation. "Did you hear what I said?" Midge heard. She heard every word. She heard the 40 years of making his coffee at 6:45, of pressing his shirts on Sunday nights, of sitting alone at restaurant tables while he took calls, of learning to sleep on her side of the bed, as if the empty space next to her during his business trips were simply another piece of furniture. She heard all 40 years collapse into 4 sentences. She asked only one question. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. "How old is she?" Douglas blinked. Of all the reactions he'd prepared for this one, this quiet surgical inquiry seemed to catch him off balance. He recovered quickly. He was a man who recovered quickly from everything except boredom. 31. The number hung in the kitchen air between the hazelnut coffee and the golden toast. 31. Their daughter Colleen was 38. This woman, this Brooke, was younger than their firstborn child. Midge sat down, not because her legs gave out though they wanted to, But because she understood in that moment that she was going to need to be seated for whatever came next, Douglas took a sitting down as acceptance. He began to explain the terms. The house would remain his. The retirement accounts built. He emphasized on his income from 23 years as a commercial land developer would be divided according to what his attorney described as an equitable arrangement. She would receive alimony for 4 years. Enough time, Douglas assured her, to get on her feet. Get on her feet, as if she had been lying down for 40 years, as if maintaining his home, raising his children, managing every detail of their domestic life so that he could focus entirely on building his career, and his portfolio and his reputation had been a form of rest. Midge did not say any of this. She sat at the table and listened to her husband dismantle their marriage with the same brisk efficiency he brought to a land acquisition. And she understood something that would take months to fully crystallize, but that she felt right then as a cold weight settling into her stomach. Douglas did not see her. He hadn't seen her in years. She was the wallpaper. She was the furniture. She was the toast. The months that followed moved in a blur of paperwork and humiliation. Douglas's legal team, 3 attorneys from a firm downtown, the kind with dark wood paneling and leather chairs, built their case with mechanical precision. Every asset was categorized, appraised, and attributed to Douglas's labor. The house purchased with his income, the investment accounts funded by his commissions, the vacation property in McCall, his bonus from the Clearwater deal in 2009. Linda Midge had been a homemaker. The word appeared 17 times in the legal documents. Homemaker. As if it were a diagnosis. Her court-appointed attorney, a young man named Pearson, who looked barely old enough to have passed the bar, did what he could. But the math was brutal. 40 years of invisible labor. The thousands of dinners, the school volunteering, the client entertainment, the holidays. Orchestrated down to the napkin folds, none of it appeared on a balance sheet. In the arithmetic of divorce court, Midge Calloway's 4 decades of contribution equaled 0. Their children tried to stay neutral. Colleen, 38, an occupational therapist in Portland, called every Sunday and said careful things. She loved both her parents. She didn't want to take sides. Nolan, 35, who worked in commercial lending in Boise, a career Douglas had helped him land, was more direct in his neutrality. He had lunch with his father on Wednesdays. He texted his mother on weekends, short messages. Hope you're doing okay, Mom. The period instead of a question mark said everything. The final hearing was in August, 4 months after the kitchen conversation. The courtroom was air-conditioned to a temperature that made Midge's hands ache. She sat on one side with young Pearson and the manila folder containing her life. Douglas sat on the other side with his legal team, his tailored suit, and Brooke Kessler. Midge had looked her up, of course. Every discarded wife looks up the replacement. Brooke was blonde fit and worked in marketing for a craft brewery in Boise. She had an Instagram account with 4,000 followers and a smile that cost $6,000 in orthodontic work. She sat beside Douglas in the courtroom, wearing a sundress that probably cost more than Midge's monthly grocery budget, and she touched his arm with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once wondered if she was enough. The judge, a weary man with the reading glasses perched on his nose, moved through the settlement with the bored efficiency of someone who had seen this story 1,000 times. Douglas kept the house. Douglas kept the cars. Douglas kept the majority of the retirement accounts. Midge would receive $1,800 a month in alimony for 4 years. At which point, presumably, she would have figured out how to support herself at 62 with no work history, no savings, and no marketable skills. The judge said equitable twice. The word tasted like dust. Then Douglas' lead attorney, A woman named Harwick with silver hair and expensive shoes mentioned the cabin. Her tone carried the particular boredom of someone discussing an item not worth the paper it was printed on. There is one additional property, a cabin in the Sawtooth Mountains that Mr. Calloway inherited from a great uncle. It's been abandoned for approximately 12 years. No utilities, no road maintenance agreement, no assessed value beyond the land itself. We propose deeding the property to Mrs. Calloway. Douglas leaned toward Harwick and whispered something. They both smiled. It was a small shared smile, the kind exchanged between people who are enjoying a private joke at someone else's expense. Harwick's voice carried that rehearsed magnanimity, the sound of a gift no one wanted to give because no one believed it was worth giving. My client considers this a gesture of goodwill. Pearson looked at Midge with the expression of a man who knew he was holding a losing hand. Midge looked at the manila folder containing her life, the life that had just been appraised, divided and distributed like the assets of a failed business. And she said the only word she had the energy to say. Fine. The gavel came down. The marriage was dissolved. 40 years reduced to a property settlement and a cabin no one wanted. As Midge walked out of the courtroom, she heard Douglas's voice behind her, pitched just loud enough to carry. It reached her like something thrown. Enjoy the cabin, Midge. Try not to let it fall on you. Brooke's laugh followed brighter, careless, the laugh of someone who had never had to rebuild anything, because nothing had ever been taken from her. Midge kept walking. Through the courthouse lobby, past the metal detectors, through the glass doors, into the August heat. She made it to her car, the 2014 Subaru that Douglas had let her keep, because he'd already bought himself a new truck before the tears came. She sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing on her wet face, and she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. She was 62 years old. She was divorced. She had $1,800 a month for 4 years and the deed to a cabin that her ex-husband had given her as a punchline. This was her life now. This was what 40 years of devotion had purchased. The weeks after the divorce were the loneliest of Midge's life. She rented a studio apartment in Nampa with month-to-month terms and walls so thin she could hear her neighbor's television through the drywall. She unpacked what she could from the boxes she'd been allowed to take from the house, some clothes, photo albums, her mother's china set that Douglas hadn't wanted. The studio smelled like carpet cleaner and other people's cooking. She ate cereal for dinner most nights because the kitchen was too small to cook in, and because cooking for one felt like a cruelty she wasn't ready to face. Her friends from the neighborhood in Meridian sent texts at first. Thinking of you, so sorry. Let's get coffee soon. But the coffee invitations grew sparse. Divorce was uncomfortable. Some of the wives sided with Douglas, believing his version that Midge had let herself go, that she'd become boring, that a man of his energy and ambition needed a partner who could keep up. Others were sympathetic but frightened, as if divorce were contagious, as if proximity to Midge's unraveling might infect their own marriages. Colleen called on Sundays. She offered her spare bedroom in Portland. Midge heard the hesitation beneath the offer, the unspoken calculations about how a 62-year-old mother in the guest room would affect Colleen's marriage, her routine, her children's schedules. The offer was real. The enthusiasm was not. Nolan's texts grew shorter. Busy week. Talk soon. He had lunch with Douglas on Wednesdays. That hadn't changed. On a Thursday evening in September, 5 weeks after the divorce, Midge sat in her studio apartment and looked at the deed to the cabin. She'd kept it in the manila folder from the courthouse, hadn't really examined it since. The legal description was dense township range section numbers, a survey reference from 1991. The property was located outside a place called Elkhorn, which Midge had never heard of, in the Sawtooth Mountains, roughly 6 hours northeast of Boise, 25 acres. One structure, no utilities on record. She pulled up Elkhorn on her phone. The search returned almost nothing. A dot on a map where two forest roads intersected. Population too small to register on census data. The nearest real town was Stanley, 20 miles south, with a year-round population of 63. 63 people. Midge almost smiled at that. She'd be the 64th. She called Colleen that night. Her voice carried something Colleen hadn't heard in months. A note of decision, thin but present like the first thread of light before actual sunrise. I'm going to the cabin. Colleen's pause lasted 3 full seconds. Then carefully, the way one speaks to someone standing near an edge. Mom, Dad said that place is condemned. He said it's been empty for over a decade. Then it will suit me perfectly. She packed the Subaru on a cold morning in early October. Everything she owned fit. That fact, which should have been devastating, felt. Instead, like a strange freedom, the lightness of a woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to protect. She drove northeast out of Nampa as the sun came up over the high desert. And she did not look back. Not at the apartment. Not at the city. Not at the life that had been taken from her. She looked forward, at the road climbing into mountains she'd never visited toward a cabin. She'd never seen him carrying nothing but a deed and a determination that felt less like courage and more like the absence of any other option. The drive took 6 hours and 12 minutes. The last 90 minutes were on roads that barely deserved the name gravel. Giving way to packed dirt, giving way to roots carved by snowmelt and neglect. The Subaru suspension protested every mile. Twice Midge had to stop and move fallen branches from the track. The forest closed in around her ponderosa pine and Douglas fir so thick that the October sky appeared only in fragments overhead like blue glass seen through a shattered ceiling. She almost missed the turnoff. A wooden poster gray with age leaned at a 40-degree angle beside the track. No sign, no mailbox, just the post and barely visible beneath a decade of lichen, the letters ASK. LL carved into the wood. The wood, Haskell, the name from the deed. This was it. The cabin sat at the end of a 100-yard clearing that had been slowly reclaimed by the forest. Young pines pushed up through what had once been a yard. Wild grass dead now. In October stood waist-high against the walls, and the cabin itself, 900 square feet of original log construction, Midge would later learn, looked like something the mountain was in the process of swallowing. The roof sagged in the center like the spine of a tired horse. 3 of the 6 windows were broken, their openings dark and jagged. The front porch had partially detached from the main structure, its boards hanging at angles that made approaching the front door an act of faith. Moss covered the north-facing logs in a thick green carpet. Somewhere inside, something moved, a scratching, scurrying sound that suggested the cabin's current residents were not expecting company. Midge turned off the engine. The silence that followed was enormous. Not empty silence, but full silence, dense with wind and bird call, and the distant sound of water moving over rock. No traffic, no neighbor's television, no courthouse, no Douglas, just the mountain and the trees and the ruined cabin, and the woman sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide whether this was the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. She thought about turning around. She thought about Colleen's spare bedroom, about Nolan's short texts about the studio apartment in Nampa, with its thin walls and its carpet cleaner smell. She thought about Douglas's voice in the courthouse, enjoy the cabin, and Brooke's bright, careless laugh. She got out of the car. The mountain air hit her like a splash of cold water. Pine and earth and the mineral edge of approaching snow. She stood beside the Subaru and breathed it in, and something shifted in her chest. Not hope, not yet. Something more basic. Space. For the first time in months, there was space around her. Space to stand, space to breathe, space to fall apart without anyone watching. She approached the porch, carefully testing each board before committing her weight. The front door was locked, but the wood around the latch had rotted so thoroughly that a firm push with her shoulder broke it open. The smell rolled out mold animal urine, the deep damp reek of years without ventilation. She pulled her jacket over her nose and stepped inside. One larger room, a stone fireplace on the west wall, its chimney disappearing into the sagging ceiling. A kitchen area if two rotted counters and a rusted iron sink qualified as a kitchen. A ladder missing several rungs leading to a loft space that was presumably the bedroom. The floor was a patchwork of intact boards and gaps, where boards had rotted through, entirely revealing dark earth below. Everything was covered in dust and debris, shredded newspaper, animal nest, broken glass, the unidentifiable residue of a decade without human care. It was uninhabitable. It was a disaster. It was the worst thing Douglas could have given her, which is exactly why he'd given it. Midge stood in the center of the ruin and felt something move through her that she hadn't felt since the morning of the hazelnut coffee. Anger. Not the dull, defeated anger of the courtroom. Not the weeping, helpless anger of the studio apartment. This was clean anger, bright anger. The kind of anger that doesn't destroy, it builds. The kind that says, you think this is my grave, but I will make it my ground. Her voice came out rough, startling in the silence, aimed at no one and everyone. Fine. You wanted me to disappear into this. Let's see what I make of it. That first night, she allowed herself to break. She had earned it. She lay in the sleeping bag she'd brought on the floor of a cabin with no heat and no light, except the beam of a flashlight balanced on a windowsill. And she cried in a way she hadn't permitted herself to cry since August. Not quietly, not politely. She cried the way a woman cries when 40 years of careful, quiet, accommodating life have been reduced to a manila folder and a ruin and a man's laugh in a courthouse hallway. She cried until her ribs ached and her throat burned, and there was nothing left to cry. Then she slept. And in the morning, the October sun came through the broken windows and fell on her face, and she opened her eyes to a silence so clean it felt like the first day of something. She got up, she got to work. The first week was about survival. Midge had some money, $1,200 in a savings account Douglas hadn't known about, plus the first alimony check due in November. She drove the 90 minutes to Stanley and bought what she needed: a camp stove, a propane lantern, jugs of water, cleaning supplies, work gloves, trash bags. The hardware store in Stanley was small but well-stocked. Mountain people needed hardware the way city people needed coffee shops. The woman behind the counter, a broad-shouldered 50-something with the reading glasses on a chain, and a name tag that said, Della, looked at Midge's purchases with the appraising eye of someone who could read a life story from a shopping list. Della's voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of a woman who had seen plenty and judged little. Moving in or tearing down. Moving in. Up on the mountain. The Haskell place. Della's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She said nothing else, but she packed the supplies carefully, and she threw in a box of waterproof matches without charging for them. Back at the cabin, Midge began the work of making ruin livable. She opened every window that would open, letting October air sweep through rooms that hadn't breathed in years. She filled trash bag after trash bag, rotted fabric, shredded paper, animal nests built from insulation and newspaper, broken glass. The desiccated body of a bird that had flown in through a broken window and never found its way out. She carried each bag to the edge of the clearing and stacked them for a future dump run. The work was hard. Midge's body had not been prepared for this. Her back seized after 3 hours of bending. Her hands softened by 40 years of light housework, and hand lotion blistered on the first day and cracked on the second. Her knees ached on the ladder. Her shoulders burned from hauling bags. She was 62, and her body informed her of this fact constantly, with the patient insistence of a debt collector. But there was something in the work, something she hadn't expected. Each bag of debris she dragged out of the cabin felt like a piece of her old life being carried away. Each surface she scrubbed on her hands and knees with a brush and a bucket of soapy water she'd heated on the camp stove was a small territory reclaimed. The cabin was filthy and broken and rotting, and so was she, and they were going to fix each other or die trying. By the end of the first week, the cabin was empty of debris. Still ruined, still unlivable by any reasonable standard, but clean ruin. And that Midge decided was progress. It was on the ninth day, while pulling up a section of rotted floorboard near the kitchen area, that Midge found the first nail. She'd been using a crowbar. Della had sawed her prying boards loose one at a time, stacking the salvageable wood outside and discarding the rest. The board came up with a groan of old wood releasing old fasteners, and there, embedded in the joist below, was a nail unlike any she'd seen in a hardware store. Square-headed, hand-forged, about 3 inches long with a slight twist in the shaft where the blacksmith's hammer had shaped it. The iron was dark-pitted with age, but when Midge pulled it free with the claw of her hammer, it came out whole. Solid. After 150 years in the bones of this cabin, the nail was stronger than the wood it had held. She turned it in her fingers. The weight of it surprised her, heavier than a modern nail dancer made from iron that had been heated and beaten into shape by human hands. Someone had forged this nail. Someone had held it between tongs over a fire and struck it with a hammer until it was exactly the right shape to hold two pieces of wood together. And it had held. Through 150 winters, through decades of abandonment, through rot and rain and the slow surrender of everything around it, this nail had held. Midge set it on the windowsill beside her propane lantern. She went back to work. By the end of the day, she'd found 11 more. She gathered them in an empty mason jar and placed the jar on the sill, where the late afternoon light caught the dark iron and made it glow like something ancient and stubborn and refusing to quit. She didn't know yet what the nails meant. She didn't know they were the first clue. She only knew that something built by hand, something small and overlooked and buried in the wreckage, had survived everything that was supposed to destroy it. And that felt like a message she needed to hear. During the second week, Midge tackled the mold. It covered the interior walls in patches of black and green, concentrated where the roof leaks had been worst. She bought a respirator mask and industrial cleaner from Della's store, and she spent days scrubbing walls on a stepladder, arms trembling from the overhead work, the chemical smell, sharp even through the mask. It was Della who mentioned the old man. Midge had come in for more cleaner and a package of steel wool, and Della was restocking shelves with the unhurried rhythm of a woman who owned the place and answered to no one. Della spoke without turning around, her voice carrying the casual weight of local knowledge offered as a gift, not an obligation. You might want to talk to Oren Whitfield, lives out past the mill road. He's been up in these mountains longer than the trees, knows every cabin, every mine, every trail. Knew the Haskell family, I think, or knew someone who did. Midge filed the name away. She wasn't ready for conversations yet. She was still in the scrubbing phase of her new life, the phase where the work was so consuming and so physical that it left no room for thought, which was exactly what she needed. But on the first day of November, when the first real snow fell, and the cabin temperature dropped to a point where the camp stove couldn't compensate, Midge realized she needed a wood stove. And she didn't know how to install one. And YouTube, which had become her teacher for everything from patching a roof to replacing a window, required internet she didn't have at the cabin. She drove to Della's store. Della sold her a cast-iron wood stove, used but functional, and the chimney pipe to go with it. Then Della wrote an address on the back of a receipt and slid it across the counter. Della's pen tapped the paper twice, a punctuation mark of finality. Oren. He'll know what to do with that stove. Don't bring him anything. He doesn't like gifts. Just ask straight. Oren Whitfield lived in a small timber frame house at the end of a dirt road that branched off the main track 3 miles south of Midge's cabin. The house was immaculate, not fancy, not new, but maintained with the obsessive precision of a man who believed that taking care of things was the primary obligation of owning them. The porch was swept. The woodpile was stacked in rows, so even they looked machine-made. A workshop behind the house, its door open, revealed the walls of tools, hung on pegboard, each tool outlined in marker, so that its absence would be immediately visible. Oren himself was 74, tall, thin, in the way of men, who had spent their lives doing physical work in mountain air. His hair was white and cut close. His hands were enormous, scarred, the hands of a man who had built and repaired things for half a century. He stood on his porch and watched Midge's Subaru approach with the expression of someone who had been expecting something but wasn't sure what. Midge got out. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't explain her situation. She held up the receipt with Della's handwriting on it and said, "I bought a wood stove. I don't know how to install it. Della said you would." Oren looked at her for a long moment. His eyes, pale blue, sharp beneath heavy brows, moved from her face to her hands. Her blistered, cracked, calloused hands. The hands of a woman who had been working. His voice came quiet, unhurried. The voice of a man who measured words the way he measured lumber, twice and only what was needed. "You're in the Haskell cabin." "I am." "It's in bad shape." "It is." Another pause. Oren looked past her up the road toward the mountain where her cabin sat invisible among the pines. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The look of a craftsman seeing a raw material worth working with. "I'll come by tomorrow morning, have the stove inside and the spot cleared where you want it. I'll bring the tools." I did. Oren arrived at 7 the next morning, in a truck older than Midge's marriage, carrying a toolbox that weighed more than the stove itself. He installed the stove and chimney pipe in 4 hours, speaking perhaps 30 words total. When it was done and the first fire was crackling in the new stove, filling the cabin with warmth for the first time since Midge had arrived, Oren stood by the door and looked at the jar of iron nails on the windowsill. He crossed the room and picked up the jar, held it to the light, turned it slowly. His face changed, something softened behind the weathered surface, a flicker of recognition that went deeper than hardware. His voice dropped quieter, now almost reverent. The way a man speaks in a church or beside a grave, square cut, hand forged, these are original. Maybe earlier. Emmett Haskell built this cabin with his own forge. Most people, when they see a rotten building, they see trash. They don't think about what's still holding. He set the jar back on the sill, then at the door, almost as an afterthought. His words came with the particular weight of something held back for a long time. Released now only because the right person was finally in the room. Watch the ground behind the cabin, 20 yards past the tree line toward the creek. There's a root cellar Haskell dug. Hatch's wood probably rotted through by now. Careful where you step. Then he left. No small talk. No questions about why a 62-year-old woman was living alone in a condemned cabin in the Sawtooth Mountains in November. Just the stove, the nails, and the warning about the root cellar. Midge waited 3 days before she looked. Not because she wasn't curious, she was burning with it, but because 3 days of snowfall had to be cleared from the path behind the cabin before she could safely walk the 20 yards to the tree line. She shoveled with a flat-edged shovel Della had sold her, her breath making clouds in the mountain air, her arms aching, her 62-year-old body protesting every movement, while also quietly growing stronger from it. On the 4th day, she found the hatch. It was exactly where Oren had said, 20 yards past the tree line, in a slight depression in the ground that she'd walked over at least a dozen times without noticing. The hatch was wood oak perhaps, and it had partially rotted, but the iron hinges, hand-forged, she noticed immediately, same as the nails, still held. She cleared the snow and dirt and dead leaves away from the edges, gripped the iron ring set into the wood, and pulled. The hatch resisted, then gave way with a groan that sounded almost human. Below, stone steps descended into darkness. Cold air rose from the opening, carrying a smell different from the cabin's molded drier mineral. The smell of earth and stone undisturbed for decades. Midge retrieved her flashlight from the cabin. She tested each stone step before putting her weight on it. The root cellar was small, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, with a low ceiling that forced her to duck. Stone walls dry stacked surprisingly intact. A wooden shelf along one wall held nothing but dust. But on the floor in the far corner, partially buried under a collapse of earth, from one wall sat a metal box. Not large, perhaps the size of a bread loaf, Tinshi thought. Or maybe steel with a hinged lid and a clasp that had rusted shut. It was wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, now brittle and fragmentary. The box was heavy for its size. Midge's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She carried the box up the stone steps and into the cabin. She set it on the table, the one piece of furniture. She'd kept a plank table she'd scrubbed and stabilized during her first week. She used the crowbar to break the rusted clasp. The lid opened with a sound like a sigh, like something exhaling after holding its breath for 150 years. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had preserved them from the moisture that destroyed everything else, were papers. Not modern papers. Thick, heavy paper, the kind made before industrial mills standardized everything. She unfolded them carefully, her blistered fingers trembling. The first document was a deed, dated 1873, registering a mineral claim on the property, specifically a claim on a natural thermal spring discovered on the northeastern portion of the land. The language was formal, archaic, and absolutely clear. Emmett Haskell had found hot water coming out of the mountain, and he'd filed a legal claim on it. The second document was a chemical analysis, dated of 1874, conducted by an assayer in Boise City, the old name for Boise. The spring water contained high concentrations of silica, lithium, boron, and sulfate minerals. The assayer's note in careful copperplate handwriting stated that the water's mineral composition was comparable to the celebrated springs of Arkansas and Virginia, and suitable for therapeutic application. The third was a set of architectural drawings, hand-drawn, detailed, beautiful in their precision. Plans for a bathhouse. Stone foundation, timber frame, 3 private soaking rooms, a common pool. Emmett Haskell had planned to build a mineral spa on this mountain a century and a half ago. The fourth was a letter dated January 1876, from Haskell to a potential investor in San Francisco. The tone was apologetic, almost defeated. The financial panic of 1873 had dried up capital. The railroad hadn't come as close as promised. Development was postponed indefinitely. I will return to this work when circumstances allow, Haskell had written. The spring will wait. It has waited longer than any of us. Circumstances had never allowed. Emmett Haskell had died of what Midge didn't know yet. The property had passed through the hands that apparently never knew what lay beneath the soil. It had ended up with Douglas's great-uncle, who'd used it as a hunting cabin until arthritis made the drive impossible. Then Douglas had inherited it and declared it worthless. Then Douglas had given it to Midge as a joke. At the bottom of the box, beneath the papers, lay a single object, a hand-forged iron nail, larger than the ones in the cabin walls, a 6-inch spike, the kind used for heavy structural work. It was wrapped separately in its own piece of oilcloth, placed deliberately, as if Haskell had wanted whoever found this box to understand something. This nail built the cabin. This nail held the floor above the cellar, that held the box, that held the secret. Everything was connected. Everything held. Midge sat at the plank table with the document spread before her and the 6-inch nail in her hand, and she looked at the jar of smaller nails on the windowsill, and she looked at the cabin around her. The cabin that Douglas had called trash, that his lawyers had described as having no assessed value, that he had given her with a smirk and a laugh, and the casual cruelty that still echoed in her chest. And she understood with a clarity that cut through every fog of grief and humiliation and self-doubt that had clouded her since that April morning in the hazelnut-scented kitchen, that Douglas Calloway was wrong. He was wrong about the cabin. He was wrong about the property. And he was wrong about her. He had looked at her the same way he'd looked at this place, saw something old, something worn, something that had stopped being useful to him, and he'd thrown it away without ever looking closely enough to see what was actually there. The spring was down there. Somewhere on these 25 acres, hot mineral water was rising through rock. The same water Emmett Haskell had found 150 years ago, still flowing, still warm, still carrying its cargo of healing minerals to the surface, waiting for someone to find it again. Waiting for someone stubborn enough and desperate enough and angry enough to look. Midge placed the 6-inch nail in the jar with the others. It stood taller than the rest, like a centerpiece, like a monument. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the drawings of the bathhouse that was never built, at the assayer's report, at Emmett Haskell's letter to the investor who never came. She spoke to the empty cabin, to the ghost of a man who dug a cellar and hidden his dream inside a tin box, and trusted that someday someone would find it. Her voice came low and steady, the voice of a woman making a promise she intended to keep. "I'll build it, Emmett. You waited long enough." Outside, the November wind moved through the ponderosa pines, and the last light of the short mountain day caught the jar of iron nails on the sill and made them glow dark, ancient, unbroken, like a row of small stubborn flames that refused to go out. The next morning, Midge spread Emmett Haskell's hand-drawn map on the plank table and studied it until the lines blurred. The map showed the spring's location relative to the cabin, northeast past a stand of what Haskell had labeled white bark pine, near a rock formation he'd sketched as 3 stacked boulders. But 150 years of forest growth, erosion, and seasonal flooding had rearranged the landscape in ways no map could account for. The white bark pines, if they'd ever existed, were gone. The rock formation could be any of a dozen clusters scattered across the mountainside. The spring might be 10 yards from where she was standing, or a quarter-mile away, buried under decades of sediment and root systems. Midge put on her boots, zipped her heaviest jacket, and walked into the November cold to find it. She walked for 5 hours that first day. 25 acres didn't sound like much until you were covering it on foot in snow, on terrain that rose and fell without warning, through brush that grabbed at your ankles and branches that slapped your face if you didn't duck fast enough. By noon, her feet were numb. By 2 o'clock, her left knee had developed a sharp complaint that worsened with every downhill step. By 4, when the mountain shadow swallowed the remaining daylight, she'd covered perhaps a third of the property and found nothing. No warm ground, no unusual vegetation, no mineral deposits on rock surfaces, nothing that suggested hot water moving beneath the earth. She limped back to the cabin, fed the wood stove heated soup on the camp stove, and sat at the table with the map again. Tomorrow she would cover the next third. The second day was worse. Freezing rain turned the ground into a sliding puzzle of mud and ice. Midge fell twice, the first time catching herself on a branch, the second time going down hard on her right hip, in a way that sent pain radiating from her pelvis to her ankle. She lay on the wet ground for a full minute, staring up at the gray Idaho sky through a lattice of pine branches, and she thought about the studio apartment in Nampa, about its thin walls and carpet cleaner smell, about how warm it had been. She got up, she kept walking, she found nothing. The third day, the fourth, the fifth. Each morning she woke before dawn, stiff and aching her body, cataloging its protest in a language that grew louder each day. She developed a system, grid squares marked on the map with pencil, each square crossed off as she covered it. Methodical, patient, completely fruitless. The mountain kept its secrets. On the sixth day, she drove to Della's store for supplies and found Oren standing by the register buying a box of wood screws. He looked at her hands, raw cracked a bruise spreading across her right palm. From a fall she hadn't mentioned to anyone, and he looked at her face, which had taken on the particular expression of someone running on determination alone, the fuel gauge past empty. I didn't ask what she was doing. He already knew. Elkhorn was too small for secrets, and Della Midge had learned and functioned as the town's unofficial information exchange. Oren paid for his screws, then without turning to face her, speaking to the wall of drill bits behind the counter, as if the advice were too casual to warrant eye contact. You're looking for heat in the wrong season. Snow's your friend. Find a morning after a hard freeze 12:15 below. Walk the northeast quadrant at first light. Anywhere the ground is holding heat, the snow will tell you. It melts different, thinner, patchy. Look for the bald spots. He left, that was all. No offer to come along, no map marked with an X, just a direction and a method and the assumption that Midge would figure out the rest. She waited 11 days for the right conditions. 11 days of continuing to repair the cabin, replacing the broken windows with second-hand panes. Della ordered from Stanley, patching the worst of the roof leaks with tar paper and roofing nails. Nails learning through failure how to cut and fit a floorboard to replace the rotted sections. Each repair taught her something. Each mistake, the board cut too short, the nail driven crooked. The tar paper laid against the grain, so that water pooled instead of sheeting off, was a lesson purchased with bruised thumbs and wasted material, and the particular frustration of a woman who had spent 62 years being competent at things that now seemed to belong to a different person's life. But the cabin was changing, slowly, unevenly, with the halting progress of someone learning a new language, one word at a time. It was becoming less ruin and more shelter. The wood stove kept the main room warm. The new windows held the wind out. The patched roof, while far from watertight, had reduced the leaks from 7 to 2, and Midge was changing with it. Her hands, which had blistered and cracked and bled during the first weeks, were developing calluses thick, harder pads of skin on her palms and fingertips that no longer tore when she gripped a hammer or pulled a nail. Her arms, which had trembled after 30 minutes of overhead work in October, could now manage 2 hours before the shaking started. She was still 62. Her body still reminded her of this every morning when she swung her legs out of the sleeping bag and felt her joints negotiate the first movements of the day. But she was a different 62 than she'd been 2 months ago. Harder, quieter, more certain of what she could survive. On a morning in late December, Midge woke to a stillness so complete it felt like the mountain was holding its breath. The thermometer Della had given her, a mercury tube mounted on a cedar plank, hung beside the front door, read 14 below zero. The inside of the cabin windows were furred with frost. Her water jugs had frozen solid overnight, despite being 3 feet from the wood stove. She dressed in every layer she owned, filled the thermos with coffee heated on the camp stove, and walked into the pre-dawn dark toward the northeast quadrant of her property. The snow was deep knee-high in places, crusted on top with a shell of ice that broke under her weight, with each step plunging her shin-deep into the powder beneath. Walking was exhausting. Each step required lifting her foot above the crust, stepping forward, breaking through, sinking, pulling free, repeating. Within 20 minutes, her thighs were burning. Within 40, her breath was coming in ragged gasps that crystallized instantly in the frozen air, forming brief clouds that dispersed before the next breath replaced them. But the light was coming, and as the first gray wash of dawn spread across the eastern sky, Midge began to see what Oren had told her to look for. The snow was not uniform. Most of the ground was covered in a smooth, unbroken white sheet, glittering where the early light caught the ice crystals on its surface. But here and there, small patches no larger than a dinner plate, the snow was thinner, softer. In 3 places it had melted entirely, leaving circles of dark, bare earth. exposed to the freezing air like small warm eyes staring up from the white face of the mountain. Midge knelt beside the largest of these bare patches. She pulled off a glove and pressed her palm flat against the exposed ground. Warm, not hot, not steaming, but warm, the unmistakable warmth of heated water moving through rock somewhere below. Below, radiating upward through soil and stone, keeping this small circle of earth alive, while everything around it froze. She started digging with the folding camp shovel she'd brought. The topsoil was soft unfrozen despite the 14 below air temperature. 6 inches down, her shovel hit moisture. A foot down, water began seeping into the hole, and when she touched it, she pulled her hand back in surprise. It was warm, genuinely warm, bath temperature warm. Midge sat back on her heels in the snow, her wet glove steaming in the cold air, and she looked at the small hole filling with warm mineral water. She could smell the faint sulfur edge of it, the same smell described in the assayer's report from 1874. And she pressed both palms flat against the warm, wet earth and felt the mountain's pulse beating against her skin. She didn't cry this time. She was past crying. She simply knelt in the snow in the Sawtooth Mountains of central Idaho. 62 years old, alone, with cracked hands and a bruised hip and a body that ached in places she couldn't name. And she felt something she hadn't felt since before the hazelnut coffee morning: certainty. Not hope, certainty. The spring was real. The water was warm. The minerals were there. Emmett Haskell's dream was still alive, still rising through the rock. Still waiting. She marked the spot with a cairn of stones and walked back to the cabin. And for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel the cold. The weeks that followed were consumed by a new kind of work. Midge needed the spring water tested not by an assayer from 1874, but by a modern laboratory that could confirm the mineral content and certify it safe for therapeutic use. She needed to file for historical preservation status. She needed permits. She needed plans. She needed money she didn't have for things she didn't yet fully understand. She started at the Elkhorn Public Library, a single room attached to the post office, staffed 2 days a week by a retired school teacher named Pauline, who wore bifocals and knew the Dewey Decimal System the way surgeons knew anatomy. Midge spent hours there, using the library's internet connection to research mineral springs, historical preservation grants, spa development regulations in Idaho. She took notes in a spiral notebook, filling page after page with information that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The cost of professional water testing alone was $2,200. Environmental impact assessments could run $10,000. Historical designation required documentation, site surveys, expert evaluation. Development permits required engineering plans, septic designs, road access studies. The numbers climbed into territories that made her alimony checks look like pocket change. But within the maze of regulations and costs, Midge found a thread. The Idaho State Historical Society administered grants for the preservation and restoration of sites with documented historical significance. If she could prove that the Haskell mineral spring had been discovered and documented in the 1870s, and she had the original papers to prove exactly that, she could apply for funding to restore the site. The grants weren't enormous, $50,000 to $100,000 typically. But it was a start. It was possible. She began writing the application on a Tuesday night in January, sitting at her plank table with the wood stove crackling and the jar of iron nails catching firelight on the windowsill. She wrote in longhand first, as she'd never been good with computers, and the library's internet was only available 2 days a week, then typed the application on an ancient desktop at the library, while Pauline pretended not to read over her shoulder. The application required the photographs, historical documentation, a site description, a development proposal, and letters of support. Midge provided the photographs herself, the cabin, the spring site, the original documents from the tin box, the hand-forged nails as evidence of 1870s construction. She wrote the site description in plain language because she didn't know any other kind. She described what she'd found, what the documents showed what the spring could become. She was honest about her limitations. No development experience, no construction background, no business history. She was also honest about what she'd done, the cabin restoration, the months of solo work, the spring discovery. She wrote, I am 62 years old and I have no credentials for this project, except that I am here, I am willing to work and I will not quit. Pauline, reading the draft over her bifocals, had looked up with an expression Midge couldn't quite read, something between admiration and the careful neutrality of a woman who had seen too many dreams die in these mountains to invest prematurely in any of them. Pauline's voice was measured the voice of a teacher, returning a paper that showed promise but needed revision. You might want to mention the nails. The nails. The hand-forged nails, their physical evidence of the construction date. Any historian will recognize them as pre-1880 manufacture, their proof. Midge added a paragraph about the nails. She included photographs of 6 of them laid out on the planker table next to a ruler for scale. She mailed the application in early February, walking it to the Elkhorn post office herself, holding the envelope for a moment before releasing it into the mailbox, the way a person holds a message in a bottle before throwing it into the sea, knowing the odds but throwing it anyway. Then she waited. And while she waited, life in Elkhorn shifted around her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started small. A cord of firewood appeared at the edge of her clearing one morning, split stacked dry with no note and no tire tracks fresh enough to identify the donor. 2 days later, Della called the cabin's new landline installed the previous week. Midge's first utility to say that the customer had returned a set of plumbing fittings that happened to be exactly the size Midge needed for the kitchen sink she was trying to install. I can hold them for you if you want, no charge. Customer already got his refund. At the library, Pauline began setting aside books she thought Midge might find useful, histories of Idaho mining towns, guides to historical preservation applications, a biography of a woman who'd homesteaded alone in the Bitterroot Mountains in 1911. She never said, I thought of you when I saw this. She simply left them on the corner of the desk where Midge always sat with a bookmark at the relevant chapter. And Oren. Oren came by the cabin every week or two, always with a purpose, returning a tool Midge had borrowed. Dropping off a piece of hardware he happened to have a spare, of checking the chimney draft on the wood stove. He never stayed long. He never offered advice unless asked. But when Midge asked how to frame a doorway, how to grade a drainage ditch, how to read the grain of a board to know which way it would warp, he answered with the patient precision of a man who believed that knowledge was meant to be given away, not hoarded. One afternoon in March, while helping Midge replace the last section of rotted porch decking, Oren paused and looked at her work. The boards she'd measured and cut herself the joints. She'd fitted the nails she'd driven. He ran his hand along the railing she'd built, testing its strength. He didn't say good job or you're getting better or any of the things people say when they want to encourage someone. He simply nodded once, picked up his end of the next board, and they continued working. The nod was enough. From Oren, it was practically a standing ovation. In late March, Midge's phone rang at 7 in the evening. She was scrubbing the cabin floor, the new floor, the one she'd laid herself over the past 2 months, board by board, nail by nail, and she almost didn't answer. The number was Boise, area code unfamiliar. Nolan's voice came through the speaker with a brightness that felt rehearsed, the particular cheerfulness of someone building toward a request. Mom, hey, how are you doing up there? Midge sat down on the floor, her wet knees leaving dark patches on the new wood. Nolan hadn't actually called, not texted in over 3 months. The last text had been a thumbs-up emoji in response to a photo she'd sent of the repaired porch. She kept her voice even. "I'm good, Nolan. Working on the cabin." "Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to talk about. The property." Something in his tone shifted the brightness, thinning, revealing the scaffolding beneath it. Midge felt the muscles in her jaw tighten. She waited. Nolan continued, and now the script was audible, the words too smooth, too organized to be spontaneous. "So I've been talking to some people, a development group called Ridgeline Partners. They're doing resort properties in the Sawtooth area. High-end stuff. Eco-lodges, hot spring retreats, that kind of thing. They're very interested in your land, Mom. They've done research. They know about the spring." The silence that followed was long enough for Midge to hear the fire shifting in the wood stove, a log settling against the grate with a soft thump. Her voice came out very quiet, the kind of quiet that anyone who knew her well would have recognized as dangerous. "How do they know about the spring, Nolan?" Another pause, shorter. Nolan's response carried the faint defensive edge of a man who knew he'd been caught, but hadn't yet decided whether to admit it. "I might have mentioned it to some colleagues who mentioned it to other colleagues. And these colleagues work with Ridgeline Partners. They're good people, Mom, serious investors. They're offering $400,000 for the property. Cash. Clean deal. That's enough for you to buy a nice condo in Boise, live comfortably, not have to." "Who connected you to them, Nolan?" The longest pause yet. Through the phone, Midge could hear something in the background, a restaurant maybe. Glasses clinking, the ambient murmur of people living comfortable lives in warm rooms. Nolan's voice dropped the rehearsed brightness, finally collapsing into something more honest and more guilty. "Dad knows one of the partners. He introduced us, but Mama, this isn't about Dad. This is a real offer. 400,000. You could... Your father, the man who gave me this property as a joke, the man who laughed in my face in a courtroom, that man is now trying to sell it out from under me through my own son. Mom, that's not. Tell Ridgeline Partners the property is not for sale. And Nolan." Midge paused. She looked at the jar of nails on the windowsill, at the floor she'd laid with her own hands, at the walls she'd scrubbed and patched and insulated through a winter that should have broken her. She let the pause lengthen until it carried the weight she intended. "Don't call me again on someone else's behalf. If you want to talk to your mother, call your mother. But don't be his errand boy. You're better than that, even if you don't know it yet." She hung up. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from the particular tremor that comes when you feel a crack open in the one wall you thought was solid. The wall of your child's loyalty, and you realize that the same man who took your marriage, your home, your security, and your self-worth is now reaching through your own son to take the last thing you have. She sat on a new floor for a long time after that, the phone dark beside her, the fire burning down in the stove. She didn't cry. She had used up all her crying in October. What she felt instead was something harder and colder, a resolve that settled into her bones like iron, like a nail driven into wood so deep it becomes part of the structure. April arrived with mud and meltwater, and a letter from the Idaho State Historical Society. Midge opened it at the kitchen counter. The new counter installed over a rebuilt cabinet frame, the first piece of real cabinetry she'd ever attempted. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was not. The envelope was thin. She'd read enough about grant applications to know that thin envelopes usually meant no. The letter was polite, professional, and devastating. The committee appreciated her application. The historical documentation was compelling. The site showed genuine promise. However, the application lacked sufficient archaeological and geological evidence to meet the threshold for funding. A professional site survey conducted by a certified historical archaeologist was recommended. Mineral water analysis by an accredited laboratory was required. The committee encouraged her to reapply with supplementary documentation. Midge set the letter on the counter and placed both hands flat on the surface the way Douglas used to place his hands on the kitchen table, a gesture she didn't recognize as inherited until this moment. She stood there for a long time, palms pressed against the wood, feeling the grain under her calluses, and she let the disappointment move through her without fighting it. That evening, she sat on the porch, her porch, the one she'd rebuilt with a blanket over her shoulders, and the April cold settling into the valley below. She turned an iron nail between her fingers, the small one, the first one she'd found. Its edges were rough against her calloused thumb. She thought about quitting. She let herself think it fully, completely, without resistance, what quitting would look like. The condo in Boise, the comfortable surrender, the quiet of fading into a life that was warm and safe and small. She called Colleen. It was late 9 o'clock in Portland, but Colleen answered on the second ring as if she'd been waiting. Midge's voice came out rawer than she intended, stripped of the careful composure she usually maintained for her children, the armor cracking just enough to let the exhaustion show. I don't know if I can do this, Colleen. The grant was rejected. I don't have money for the testing they need. I'm 62 years old and I'm sitting on a porch I built myself in the dark, and I don't know if any of this is going to work. Colleen was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried something Midge hadn't heard from her daughter before. Not pity, not the careful neutrality of someone trying not to take sides, but the firm, clear tone of a woman who had watched her mother do impossible things for 6 months and was tired of pretending otherwise. Colleen's words arrived one at a time, deliberate as footsteps on a bridge she was building between them. Mom, you replaced a roof in a snowstorm. You installed plumbing from a YouTube video. You found a hot spring that's been lost for 150 years. You did all of this alone at 62 after the worst year of your life. And you're asking me if you can do this. Midge looked at the nail in her hand. The iron caught the faint light from the cabin window. She went back inside. She sat at the plank table. She pulled out the spiral notebook and began making a list. The water testing cost $2,200. She had $1,400 in savings and next month's alimony check of $1,800. She could afford the testing if she ate rice and beans for a month and didn't buy propane. The site survey was the harder problem. A certified historical archaeologist would charge $5,000 minimum. She didn't have $5,000. She wouldn't have $5,000 for months, and by then the application window would close. Della solved the first problem without being asked. When Midge came in for supplies and mentioned in passing that she needed to ship water samples to a lab in Boise, Della reached under the counter and produced a set of sterile collection bottles, the specific kind used for mineral water analysis, the kind that cost $40 per set. Della slid them across the counter with the same matter-of-fact economy she applied to everything, a woman who had decided something and didn't see the point in discussing it. Had these left over from a project that didn't happen. Yours if you want them. Midge looked at Della. Della looked at the register. The site survey problem solved itself differently. Pauline, the librarian, had a cousin. The cousin had a colleague. The colleague was a retired historical archaeologist from the University of Idaho who had spent 30 years surveying sites across the state and who, in his retirement, occasionally took on pro bono projects that interested him. His name was Dr. Ellis Marchetti. He was 71. And when Pauline described the Haskell cabin and the mineral spring documents, he drove 4 hours from Moscow, Idaho to see them for himself. Dr. Marchetti spent 2 days on the property. He photographed the cabin's construction, the dovetail joints, the stone foundation, the hand-forged hardware. He examined the nails with a jeweler's loupe and dated them to between 1870 and 1878 based on the forging technique. He surveyed the root cellar, the spring site, and the surrounding terrain. He was a small, precise man who spoke in complete paragraphs and treated the cabin with the reverence other people reserved for cathedrals. His voice carried the controlled excitement of a man who had spent a career looking for things like this and had learned to contain his enthusiasm behind professional language. Mrs. Calloway, this site is significant. The cabin is one of the best preserved examples of vernacular log construction from the 1870s mining era in central Idaho. The spring documentation is exceptional. I've never seen original assay reports in this condition. And the nails. He held one up to the light, turning it slowly. The nails are museum-quality artifacts. You're living in a historical site. I wrote the site survey report for free. He submitted it with a letter of professional endorsement that Midge read 3 times each time, finding a new sentence that made her chest ache with gratitude and disbelief. The second application went out in May, thicker this time. The water analysis which Midge had collected herself wading into the spring excavation in rubber boots, filling each sterile bottle according to the lab's precise instructions. Instructions confirmed what the 1874 assayer had found. High mineral content, therapeutic grade lithium and silica concentrations. Water temperature averaging 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The lab report noted that the mineral profile was comparable to commercially operated hot spring facilities in Idaho and Montana. Midge mailed the application on a Thursday. She walked to the post office, held the envelope, and this time she didn't hesitate. She'd done everything she could. The rest was out of her hands. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early June, when the meadow around the cabin was thick with lupine and Indian paintbrush, the phone rang. The woman on the other end identified herself as a program officer with the Idaho State Historical Society. Her voice was professionally warm, the controlled enthusiasm of someone delivering news they'd been looking forward to delivering. Mrs. Calloway, I'm calling to inform you that your application for preservation and restoration funding has been approved. The committee was particularly impressed by the quality of your historical documentation and the site survey conducted by Dr. Marchetti. We are approving a grant of $85,000 for site research, structural assessment, and initial restoration planning. Midge sat down on the porch step. The wood was warm from the June sun, the porch she'd rebuilt, the boards she'd cut, the nails she'd driven. She pressed her free hand flat against the warm planking and felt the solid, steady structure she'd built holding her weight without complaint. Her voice came out as a whisper, the only volume she could manage without breaking. Thank you. She sat on that step for a long time after hanging up. She didn't call anyone. She didn't celebrate. She simply sat in the June morning with the mountains rising around her, and the lupine blooming in the meadow, and the distant sound of the spring. She'd found she could hear it now. A faint gurgling where the warm water surfaced through the rocks she'd cleared. And she let the reality settle into her, the way the iron nails had settled into the wood of this cabin. Slowly, permanently, becoming part of the structure. The grant changed everything, and it changed nothing. The money meant professionals, engineers to assess the spring's flow rate and temperature stability, architects to design a small bathhouse that honored Haskell's original plans, contractors to handle the structural work that was beyond Midge's growing, but still limited skills. But Midge remained the center. She was on site every day. She worked alongside the contractors, carrying lumber, mixing concrete, learning to read blueprints. She made every decision. She signed every check. She stood in the spring excavation in her rubber boots while the engineers took measurements. And she stood in the cabin while the architect spread drawings on her plank table. And she stood on her porch while the contractor explained timelines and budgets. And she did not once step back and let someone else drive. The summer passed in a blur of construction and progress. The cabin's restoration accelerated with professional help. Proper insulation, a real plumbing system, electrical wiring, a kitchen that functioned as a kitchen rather than a campsite. The bathhouse foundation was poured in July, its footprint matching Haskell's 1875 drawings. So closely that Dr. Marchetti, visiting for a progress check, stood at the edge of the excavation and shook his head in quiet amazement. By September, the bathhouse walls were rising. Timber frame over stone foundation, 3 private soaking rooms, a changing area, a small reception space. Historically designed but built to modern code. The spring water was piped from the source through insulated lines. The engineer's idea maintaining temperature from ground to pool. The first test fill of the first soaking room happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, with the Midge and the engineer and 2 of the contractors standing around the cedar-lined pool, watching warm, clear, mineral-rich water rise slowly toward the rim. Midge knelt beside the pool and put her hand in the water. It was perfect. Warm and soft and faintly sulfurous and alive in a way that tap water never was water that had traveled through rock for years. Collecting minerals, gathering heat, rising to the surface, carrying the earth's own warmth. She looked at her hand in the water. The hand that had blistered and cracked and calloused and learned to hold a hammer and drive a nail and cut a board and build a porch and dig a spring out of frozen ground. The hand that Douglas had never once noticed was capable of anything more than pouring his coffee and folding his shirts. She pulled her hand out and dried it on her jeans and went back to work. In October, a regional magazine, Idaho Mountain Living, ran a feature about the project. A journalist from Boise had heard about the Haskell Spring restoration through Dr. Marchetti's university contacts and had driven up to Elkhorn to see it for herself. The article was 3 pages long with photographs of the cabin, the bathhouse under construction, the original documents, and Midge. The headline read, "From Courthouse to Cabin, One Woman's Mountain Resurrection." The photographs showed a woman Midge barely recognized. Tanned lean, her gray hair pulled back in a braid, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her hands visible in one close-up shot as she held a hand-forged nail for the camera. Were the hands of a worker, scarred, calloused, strong. She looked nothing like the woman who had buttered toast in a suburban kitchen 18 months ago. She looked like someone who had built something. The article brought attention Midge hadn't sought. Emails arrived through the magazine's forwarding address. Women wrote to her, women in their 50s and 60s, women going through divorces. Women who felt invisible. "Your story gave me courage," one wrote. "I thought my life was over at 58. Now I'm not so sure." Midge read every letter. She answered every one. Then on a gray afternoon in late October, exactly 13 months after Midge had first pushed open the rotted door of the Haskell cabin, a certified letter arrived at her mailbox in Elkhorn. The return address was a law firm in Boise, not Hardwick's firm, but one she didn't recognize. Granger, Neville and Cooper, attorneys at law. She opened it at the kitchen counter. The new counter in the new kitchen in the cabin she'd rebuilt with her own hands, and $85,000 of grant money, and 11 months of work that had transformed both the structure and the woman inside it. The letter was 3 pages long, legal language dense and deliberate. But the core of it was simple enough to understand without a law degree. Ridgeline Partners, LLC, represented by Granger, Neville and Cope, was filing a motion with the Ada County District Court to challenge the property disposition in the Callaway divorce settlement. The motion argued that the Haskell property, having been inherited during the marriage, constituted marital property under Idaho community property law. Furthermore, the motion contended that the newly discovered mineral and historical assets on the property represented value that had not been disclosed or accounted for during the original divorce proceedings. Ridgeline Partners, having entered into an option agreement with Douglas Calloway contingent on a favorable ruling, was seeking a court-ordered reappraisal and redistribution of the property. Douglas, his name was there in the legal filing, not hiding behind Nolan this time, not using intermediaries, directly, formally, legally attempting to take back the thing he had given her as a joke, the thing she had broken her body and remade her life to save the thing that was hers. Hers because she had earned it with every blister and every bruise and every sleepless night. And every dawn she'd walked into the frozen dark to find a spring that everyone said wasn't there. Midge, said the letter on the counter. She walked to the windowsill and picked up the jar of iron nails. She held it in both hands, feeling the weight of the iron through the glass. And she looked at the nails. The nails that had held this cabin together for 150 years. Through rotten neglect and abandonment, through everything that should have destroyed them. She set the jar down. She picked up her phone and called the legal aid office in Stanley. Her voice was steady, the steadiness of a nail driven all the way in flush with the wood, immovable. My name is Marjorie Calloway. I need a lawyer. My ex-husband is trying to take my home. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on Elkhorn. It dusted the roof of the bathhouse she'd built. It settled on the porch she'd restored. It covered the meadow where the lupine had bloomed in June and would bloom again in June. And beneath all of it, beneath the snow and the soil and the stone, the spring kept flowing warm and mineral-rich and patient. The way it had flowed for centuries. The way it would flow long after every lawsuit and every act of cruelty and every small desperate grab for what belonged to someone else had been forgotten. Midge stood at her kitchen window and watched the snow fall and felt beneath the fear, beneath the anger, beneath the exhaustion of a year spent rebuilding herself from ruins. Something she recognized as the iron core of who she had become. She was not going to lose this. Not the cabin, not the spring, not the life she'd built nail by nail from what a careless man had thrown away. She was not going to lose because she could not afford to lose, and because losing was no longer something her body knew how to do. The snow kept falling, the spring kept flowing, and Midge Calloway stood in the kitchen of the house she'd saved and began to plan her defense. The legal aid attorney assigned to Midge's case was a woman named Vivian Salk, 53, with short gray-streaked hair and a voice that carried the flat, unimpressed cadence of someone who had spent 20 years representing people whom larger, better-funded firms were paid to crush. She drove to Elkhorn on a Wednesday in November, walked through the cabin, examined the bathhouse construction, read the original divorce settlement, read the Ridgeline Partners filing, and sat down at Midge's plank table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. Vivian's pen moved across the pad in quick, angular strokes as she spoke. Her voice stripped of reassurance or sentiment, offering only the architecture of the situation. There reaching, the property was deeded to you by name in the final settlement. Your ex-husband's legal team specifically described it as having no assessed value beyond the land itself. They proposed a transfer. The judge approved it. The decree is final. Midge sat across from her, hands wrapped around her own mug, feeling the heat through the ceramic. She waited for the other half. Vivian delivered it without looking up from her notes. That said, Ridgeline has money. They can stretch this out. File motions, request continuances, demand appraisals. Even a weak case costs time and energy to defend. They're betting you'll settle rather than fight. Offer you a fraction of the property's value, take the land, build their resort. And if I don't settle? Vivian looked up. Her eyes were brown and tired, and absolutely steady. She studied Midge for a moment. The calloused hands, the tanned face, the set of the jaw. And whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy something. Vivian's pen tapped the pad once, a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't written. Then we go to court and we win, because the law is on your side, And because the man who gave you this property as a joke put it in writing that he considered it worthless, that filing is our best evidence. His contempt is our strongest argument. The hearing was scheduled for January. 2 months of waiting. 2 months of continuing to build while the legal threat hung overhead like the winter clouds that settled against the sawtooth peaks and didn't lift until spring. Midge used the time the way she'd learned to use all the time she'd been given since arriving in Elkhorn. She worked. The bathhouse interior was finished in December. Cedar lined the soaking rooms, each with a window facing the mountains. Stone floors with radiant heat from the spring water piped beneath them. A small reception area with a wood stove and a bench that Oren had built from reclaimed timber. He'd appeared one morning with the finished piece in the bed of his truck set, it inside the door and left without comment, as if benches simply materialized in buildings that deserved them. Midge spent a Christmas alone. Colleen had invited her to Portland, but the trip would have meant leaving the property during the most vulnerable weeks before the hearing, and Midge couldn't bring herself to step away from the things she was fighting to keep. She cooked dinner in a restored kitchen, roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans from the general store in Stanley, and ate at the plank table with the jar of nails catching the light from 2 candles she'd set on either side like sentinels. After dinner, she walked to the bathhouse and sat on Oren's bench in the empty reception room. Moonlight came through the windows and fell across the stone floor in silver rectangles. The building smelled like cedar and mineral water, and the faint sulfur edge of the spring. She could hear the water moving through the pipes, a low constant murmur like a heartbeat, like a promise. She sat there until the candle she'd brought burned down to a stub, and then she walked back to the cabin through the snows, her boots crunching in the frozen crust, and she went to bed and she slept deeply. And she did not dream of Douglas or courtrooms or anything at all. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in January in a small courtroom in Stanley that served the surrounding mountain communities. Midge wore the best clothes she owned. Clean jeans, a pressed flannel shirt, her hair in the braid she'd adopted during her first months of cabin work. Vivian sat beside her in a gray blazer that had seen better days. Across the aisle, Ridgeline Partners was represented by 2 attorneys in suits that cost more than Midge's monthly budget. Douglas was not present. His name was in the filings, but his chair was empty. He'd sent his lawyers to do what he'd always sent others to do, the work he considered beneath him. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Ridgeline's attorneys argued that the mineral spring constituted a latent asset not accounted for in the original property valuation, and that Idaho's community property laws entitled Douglas to a share of any marital property whose value had been materially misrepresented during proceedings. Vivian dismantled the argument with the methodical patience of a woman pulling nails from rotten wood. She read aloud from the original divorce filing the specific passage where Harwick had described the property as having no assessed value beyond the land itself. She entered into evidence the transcript of the settlement hearing, in which Douglas's own legal team had called the cabin transfer a gesture of goodwill. She presented the timeline. The spring had been discovered after the divorce was finalized on property that had been legally deeded to Midge through labor, performed solely by Midge with no financial or practical contribution from Douglas. Vivian's voice filled the small courtroom with the quiet precision of a blade being drawn across a whetstone. Mr. Calloway's legal team described this property as worthless. They gave it to my client as, and I quote from 3 witnesses present at the hearing, a joke. Now that my client has made something of what Mr. Calloway discarded, he wants it back. The law does not reward that kind of arithmetic. The judge, a woman in her 60s, gray hair, reading glasses. The kind of face that suggested she'd seen every variety of human pettiness the mountain communities could produce, reviewed the filings for 45 minutes. When she delivered her ruling, her voice was dry and final. The motion was denied. The property had been legally deeded to Marjorie Calloway in a finalized divorce settlement. The value of improvements made after the transfer through the labor and initiative of the current owner did not constitute grounds for redistribution. The court found no merit in the claim and ordered Ridgeline Partners to cover Midge's legal costs. Midge sat very still while Vivian closed her briefcase. The Ridgeline attorneys left without looking at her. The courtroom emptied. Vivian touched her shoulder once a brief firm contact and went to file the paperwork. Midge sat alone in the empty courtroom for several minutes. The last time she'd been in a courtroom, she'd walked out with nothing. This time she'd walked in with everything and kept it. The symmetry felt deliberate, as if the universe had the sense of structure of justice. Of callback, the way a good story returns to its beginning and shows you how far the road has come. She drove back to Elkhorn in a silence that felt different from all the silences that had come before. Not the stunned silence of the courthouse parking lot 18 months ago. Not the grinding silence of the studio apartment. Not the lonely silence of the first nights in the cabin. A settled silence. Structural. The silence after the last nail has been driven and the frame stops creaking because everything finally is holding. The bathhouse opened for appointments in March. Small operation 3 soaking rooms open Thursday through Sunday, managed by Midge with the help from 2 part-time employees she'd hired from Stanley. A woman named Ruth, who handled bookings, and a young man named Caleb, who maintained the grounds and the spring infrastructure. Revenue was modest, steady, the kind of income that didn't make headlines, but paid the propane bill and kept the property taxes current and left enough at the end of each month to buy materials for the next improvement. People came. Not crowds. Elkhorn was too remote for crowds, and Midge didn't want crowds. They came individually in pairs by appointment. Some were tourists who'd read the Idaho Mountain Living article. Some were history enthusiasts drawn by Dr. Marchetti's write-up in a regional archaeology journal. Some were women. Women who'd found Midge's story through the article, through word of mouth, through the particular network of shared pain that connects women who have been told they are finished. These women didn't always come for the mineral baths. They came to stand in the cabin and touch the walls. They came to see the jar of nails on the windowsill. They came to sit on the porch and look at the mountains and hear from Midge if she had time. And from the landscape itself, if she didn't, that 62 was not an ending. That being discarded was not the same as being destroyed. That the worst thing that ever happened to you could turn out to be the door you didn't know you needed opened. Midge made it time for these women when she could. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't a motivational speaker. She was a 63-year-old woman with calloused hands and a rebuilt cabin and a jar of antique nails. And the only wisdom she had to offer was the kind that came from having survived something that was supposed to kill her, and discovering on the other side of it that she was more alive than she'd ever been. One afternoon in April, 15 months after the bathhouse had opened its doors, and 2 full years since she'd first pushed open the rotted door of the Haskell cabin, Midge was on the bathhouse porch, replacing a board that the winter freeze-thaw cycle had warped. She was kneeling with a pry bar working the damaged board free when she heard a car on the gravel road. Not a guest car, not the tentative crunch of someone following GPS directions to an unfamiliar destination. This was a car driven by someone who knew where they were going. Douglas's rental sedan appeared at the edge of the clearing. He parked behind Midge's Subaru and sat in the car for a long moment before getting out. Midge stayed kneeling on the porch, the pry bar in her hand, and watched him cross the distance between his car and her building, with the uncertain steps of a man walking into territory he no longer controlled. He looked diminished. Not physically smaller, though the tailored suits were gone, replaced by khakis and a fleece jacket that didn't quite fit. Diminished in the way a building looks. Diminished when the lights go out, the same structure, but hollow. He stood at the base of the porch steps and looked up at Midge. and she saw in his face something she'd never seen in 40 years of marriage: uncertainty. His voice came rough, unscripted, nothing like the rehearsed declarations she'd heard at the kitchen table, or the calculated moves she'd deflected through lawyers and through Nolan. Brooke left 8 months ago, the business I filed. Chapter 11 in September. I'm renting a one-bedroom in Nampa. Midge set the pry bar down. She stood. They were 6 feet apart, the porch steps between them, she above, he below. A reversal of every spatial arrangement their marriage had ever known. She waited. Douglas looked at the bathhouse, at the cabin beyond it, at the mountains and the trees and the property he'd thrown away like a used napkin. His jaw worked silently for a moment, the same jaw set she remembered from the kitchen. But looser now, as if the muscle had lost its certainty. His voice cracked on the second word, and he didn't bother trying to smooth it over. I made a mistake with everything, with Brooke, with the business, with the lawyers, with Nolan. I see that now. I've had a lot of time to see it. A pause. He looked at his hands. Soft hands, office hands, hands that had never held a pry bar or driven a nail. I'm not here about money, Midge. I'm not asking for the property. I know that's over. He looked up at her. And the thing in his eyes was not the contrition of a man who wanted forgiveness. It was the hunger of a man who had lost the only warmth he'd ever known, and was standing outside in the cold, looking through the window at the fire. His voice dropped to something barely louder than the sound of the spring flowing through the pipes beneath their feet. I want to come home. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to come home. Midge stood on the porch she'd rebuilt and looked down at the man she'd loved for 40 years and served for 40 years and lost herself inside of for 40 years. She looked at his soft hands and his uncertain face and the fleece jacket that didn't fit. And she felt carefully, honestly, the way you feel a piece of wood for hidden rot before you decide whether it can bear weight. What was left inside her for this man? There was compassion. She could feel it, small and genuine, the way you feel compassion for any living thing that has lost its shelter. There was sadness, not for what they'd had, she was past mourning that, but for what he'd done to himself by throwing it away. There was the faintest ghost of the love she'd carried for 4 decades, thin now, translucent, the way a nail's shadow is thin on a sunlit floor. But there was no door. The door he was looking for, the one that led back into a life where she poured his coffee and folded his shirts and arranged herself around the shape of his needs, that door was gone. Not locked. Gone. She'd pulled it from its hinges and used the wood for something else. Her voice came calm and clear, the voice of a woman who had measured this moment a long time ago and already knew its dimensions. This is my home, Douglas. I built it. You didn't help. You didn't believe. You laughed and then you sued and then you sent our son to do your bargaining. This is not your home to come back to. Douglas stood still. His eyes moved to the windowsill behind her, to the jar of nails visible through the glass. He climbed the steps, she didn't stop him, and walked to the sill and picked up the jar. He held it the way a man holds something he doesn't understand, turning it, examining it, weighing it in his palm. Iron nails, old, rusted, worthless by any metric he'd ever used to measure the world. He set the jar down and turned back to her. His voice was small now, the smallest she'd ever heard from a man who had spent his entire adult life making rooms feel like they belonged to him. What are those? They're what held this place together when everything else fell apart. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked down the steps, crossed the clearing, got in his rental car, and drove away. Midge watched until the dust settled on the gravel road, and the sound of the engine faded into the mountain silence. She picked up the pry bar and went back to work on the porch board. The summer brought Nolan. He arrived on a Saturday in late June, unannounced, driving a truck. Midge hadn't seen before. She was in the bathhouse checking mineral levels in the third soaking room when Ruth came to find her. her voice carrying the careful neutrality of a woman who didn't know whether the visitor was welcome. Midge walked outside. Nolan was standing in the meadow between the cabin and the bathhouse, turning in a slow circle, taking in everything. He'd refused to see: the restored cabin, the operating bathhouse, the grounds maintained by Caleb, the gravel parking area, the wooden sign Oren had carved and mounted at the road, Haskell Springs Est. Restored 1025. When Nolan saw his mother walking toward him, his face did something it hadn't done since he was a boy who'd broken a window with a baseball and stood waiting on the porch for consequences. It collapsed. Not dramatically, not cinematically. It simply folded inward, a slow crumpling like paper held too long over heat, all the stiffness leaving at once. His voice came thick and shattered, the voice of a 35-year-old man suddenly aware that he had acted like a child, and that the person he had wronged was the person who had loved him longest. Mom, I'm sorry for the phone call, for Ridgeline, for letting Dad use me, for not coming sooner. I'm sorry for all of it. Midge crossed the remaining distance between them and took her son's face in her calloused hands. She held it the way she'd held it when he was 3 and crying over a scraped knee, firmly, without flinching, with the absolute authority of a mother who has decided that this wound, like every wound before it, will be tended and forgiven and survived. She didn't say, "It's okay." It hadn't been okay. She didn't say, "I forgive you." That was true, but it wasn't what he needed to hear. What she said was this, quiet enough that only he could hear it. The words arriving with the weight of something she had earned the right to say. "You're here now, that's what matters." They sat on the porch that evening. Midge and Nolan and Colleen, who had driven from Portland when Nolan called her from the road, and they ate dinner together for the first time since the divorce. Grilled trout from the creek, potatoes from the Stanley Farmers Market. Salad greens Midge had grown in the small garden she'd planted behind the cabin. Simple food eaten on a porch built by hand, under a sky that was turning the particular shade of violet that the Idaho mountains produce in the last hour before dark. Nobody talked about Douglas. Nobody talked about the lawsuit or the divorce or the years of distance. They talked about Colleen's children, about Nolan's plan to leave commercial lending for something that didn't make him feel hollow, about the family of mule deer that had taken up residence in the meadow and appeared each evening at dusk like clockwork. Before they went inside, Colleen asked the question that had been forming all evening, the one Midge could see building behind her daughter's eyes, the way you can see weather building over a ridge. Colleen's voice was soft with wonder, a awe of a daughter, realizing her mother had become someone she didn't fully know and desperately wanted to understand. "Mom, how did you do all this?" Midge looked at the cabin, at the bathhouse, at the porch beneath her feet, at the jar of nails on the windowsill visible through the window catching the last light. She considered the question, the way she now considered all questions, slowly, honestly, without performing an answer for someone else's comfort. Her words came unhurried, spoken more to the darkening mountains than to her children, though they were meant for all 3 of them. The 2 beside her and the woman she'd been before any of this began. "I didn't do it all at once. I did it one nail at a time. And every nail I drove was an answer to someone who said I couldn't." Midge's 64th birthday fell on a Saturday in August. She hadn't planned anything. Birthdays, in her experience, were obligations she organized for other people. Douglas milestone dinners, the children's parties, the grandchildren's celebrations she'd orchestrated down to the napkin color. Her own birthdays had been afterthoughts. This year she'd intended to spend it the way she spent most days, working. But Della had other ideas, and Oren, and Ruth and Caleb and Pauline and Dr. Marchetti and a dozen other people from Stanley and Elkhorn who had watched a woman arrive on their mountain with nothing and build something that mattered. They appeared at noon, cars and trucks winding up the gravel road in a procession that Midge standing in the bathhouse doorway with a wrench in her hand, watched with growing bewilderment. Della brought a cake she'd baked herself, lopsided with the candles that wouldn't stay upright. Pauline brought a box of books. Ruth and Caleb brought flowers from the meadow. Colleen and Nolan and the grandchildren tumbled out of a rental van, sunburned and laughing. And Oren. Oren arrived the last away. He always arrived quietly without announcement, carrying something in his scarred hands. He found Midge on the porch while the others were inside cutting cake. He sat beside her on the bench and placed a small wooden box on her lap. Cedar hand-joined, sanded smooth as river stone. He'd made it. She could tell by the joints the same dovetail precision she saw in everything he built. She opened it. Inside, the resting on a piece of soft leather, was a single hand-forged iron nail, square-headed, 3 inches long, identical to the ones in a jar. Midge looked at him. He was watching the mountains, not her the way he always did when something mattered too much for eye contact. His voice came with the rough gentleness of a man who had spent 74 years learning how to say important things without making a speech of it. Found it under my own floorboards last spring when I was shoring up the joists. Same forge as yours. Same maker. Emmett Haskell built my cabin too 30 years before he built yours. Same iron, same hands. He paused. The mountain air moved through the pines, carrying the scent of warm earth and cedar, and the faint mineral edge of the spring. He continued, still watching the ridge. His words arriving like nails driven carefully into exactly the right place. Figured they should be together. Things from the same source ought to find each other eventually. Midge held the nail in her palm. She looked at the jar on the windowsill, visible through the cabin window. The collection of small, dark, ancient objects that had been the first thing she'd found in this place before the documents. Before the spring, before any of it. The nails that had held when everything else rotted. The nails that nobody noticed. The nails that kept the walls standing and the roof above and the floor below, and never once asked for credit or attention or thanks. She placed Oren's nail in the box and closed the lid and held it against her chest. And she didn't cry because she was done with crying. What she felt instead was something that had no name, or if it had a name, it was the name you'd give to the moment when a house that has been built, slowly nail by nail, board by board, through cold and doubt and failure, is finally finished and stands on its own for the first time. And you step back and look at it and realize that you didn't just build a house. You built the person who could build it. That night, after the guest had gone and the children were sleeping in the loft she had added during the summer, the loft with the skylight through which her grandchildren had counted 11 stars before falling asleep. Midge stepped out onto the porch alone. The August night was warm. The sky over the Sawtooth Range was the color of deep water, and the stars were the kind of stars you only see in places where no city light reaches. Not scattered, but dense, layered, a ceiling of white fire so thick it seemed structural, as if the darkness were held up by light instead of the other way around. She could hear the spring, that low, constant murmur of warm water rising through rock surfacing, flowing into the pipes. She and the engineers had laid filling the cedar-lined pools of the bathhouse she'd built on the bones of a dream. A man named Emmett Haskell had buried in a tin box 150 years ago. She could smell pine resin and the mineral warmth of the spring, and the last traces of Della's birthday cake, and the cedar of Oren's box still in her hands. She opened the box one more time, took out the nail, walked to the porch railing, the railing she'd built in her second month, the one Oren had tested with his hand and found solid, and looked at the one spot she'd left unfinished. A single empty nail hole in the top rail near the corner post, where a knot in the wood had split the original nail's path, and she'd never gotten around to filling it. She positioned the nail. Oren's nail, Haskell's nail, the nail forged from the same iron as every other nail that held this place together. and she picked up the hammer she'd left on the railing earlier that day, and she drove it home with the 3 clean strokes. The sound rang out across the clearing and echoed off the mountain and faded into the silence of the Idaho night. She set the hammer down. She ran her fingers across the nail-head flush with the wood smooth warm from her hand. Done. She sat on the porch step, her back against the post, her face tilted up toward the dense and endless sky. The cedar box was on her lap. The cabin was behind her, solid hole warm with sleeping children. The bathhouse was ahead of her, its windows dark, its pool still, its water waiting for morning. The spring was beneath all of it, patient, ancient, carrying its heat through the cold earth, the way a heart carries blood through a body, unseen, unceasing, essential. Midge Calloway, 64 years old, hands calloused, hair silver, back aching in the particular way that meant she'd done something worth doing. Sitting on a porch she'd built in front of a life she'd constructed from a pile of insults and a jar of forgotten nails, and feeling not happiness, which is a word too small for what this was, but something closer to a foundation settling weight, distributed evenly, every joint fitted, every beam plumb, every nail driven true. She had been called worthless. She had been given ruin as a farewell gift. She had been laughed at in a courtroom by a man who believed that value was something measured in dollars and square footage and the age of the woman beside you. And she had taken the ruin and the laughter and the contempt, and she had built with blistered hands and cracked nails and a body that protested every morning and obeyed every afternoon something that would stand. Not forever. Nothing stands forever. But long enough to matter. Long enough to prove that the things no one notices, the nails, the quiet labor, the stubborn refusal to accept someone else's appraisal of your worth, are the things that hold the world together. The spring murmured beneath the ground. The stars burned above the mountains, and Midge sat on her porch in the warm August dark. The nail holes filled the house, complete the woman inside it, finally, fully, irreversibly built. If this story stayed with you, leave one word in the comments, just one that describes what you're carrying right now that nobody else can see. And if someone in your life ever made you feel like you had nothing left, remember the nail. Small, ordinary, overlooked. But without it, nothing stands.